Thank you, Chris. It's a great honor to welcome all of you personally to our 14th Asia Pacific Security Summit. I was trying to remember how many of these I've been at. It's not quite 14, but it might be as many as 8 or 9. So I'm really pleased with the size of the crowd that Brenda announced. Really excited to see you all here. If we had been talking 14 years ago at the first Asia Pacific Security Summit, we would never have seen that kind of slide that Chris just presented with all those different endpoints he showed, mobile and e-commerce and Internet of Things and wearables and all kinds of ways to pay and all different technologies supporting them. We would have been talking about something much simpler. We would have been talking about credit, debit, and maybe not even prepaid. We would have been talking about credit and debit cards and how to secure them with a much smaller set of options and technologies. So when I think about what we're doing today, the one thing that seems to me to hold it all together and transcends all those different technologies, all the countries that he showed, all the population growth in that little circle of Asia Pacific, the one thing that holds it all together is trust. So I wanted to begin my presentation by talking a little bit about the evolution of trust and possibly the fragility of trust in our business. Now, the reason I feel so passionately about payment security is that I believe in this mission. Chris mentioned our vision. Visa wants to be the best way to pay and be paid for everyone everywhere. You probably have heard that before. This mission is a little bit newer. It's something that we've evolved in the last few years. And our mission at Visa, we believe, is to connect the world, to connect people throughout the world through the most innovative, reliable, and secure payment network that enables individuals, consumers, businesses, and economies to thrive. And what is it about payments that could possibly enable all those people and businesses and economies to thrive? Well, actually, it's quite generally recognized these days that digital payments are the primary on-ramp to financial inclusion in many countries throughout the world. And we've been making enormous progress in connecting people, our company and others, and all of you in this room, connecting people through digital payments with the global financial system. In fact, the number of unbanked or underserved consumers, meaning those who do not have access to the formal financial system, has fallen. So unbanked has fallen since 2011 from 2.7 billion people to 1.7 billion, according to the World Bank. And during that same time period, 612 million people who were previously underserved were issued payment accounts using Visa cards. So, of course, we all know, as Chris mentioned, we can't do any of this Visa ourselves, but together with you, our partners and other partners throughout the world, we've been able to make a visible difference in the welfare of the world through financial inclusion just by enabling digital payments. And when I think about the work we do at Visa, just making it a little bit more personal, one of the things I'm proudest of is that if you think about, let's say, a micro business owner in a small country in Africa, would be able to use the Visa Payments Network, and I said that deliberately, not necessarily a card, the Visa Payments Network, to pay not only a domestic supplier that this merchant might previously have had to pay personally in cash, traveling hours by foot or by bicycle, but even to connect with a merchant far across the world in the United States or in Asia. With the same level of confidence as I might have when I use my Visa card to pay a taxi driver that'll take me from Changi Airport to Singapore on arrival. And that all the people have that access to that same level of confidence and trust. Now, maintaining that trust, we like to think that we don't want people to even think about it, right? If they're thinking about security, they're worrying about security. But the truth is that to maintain that kind of trust and that level of security takes an amazing degree of effort. And in fact, it is easily lost. So behind me on the screen, you see some examples, but it's simple enough just to say, why not ask Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook about how easy it is to lose the confidence of some of your constituents, at the very least, in a globally connected network business. But I'm not here to talk, I'm not going to dwell on all of the things that have happened in the past that have enabled us to maintain that trust. But I will think, though, I do think it is instructive to take a quick look at how trust has evolved going back, way back, to the history of money. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I was reminded that China is widely considered to be the birthplace of currency, of coins and paper money, all the way back to the 7th century BC. So coins at the time, they have actual value, right? So a copper coin or a silver coin is something that is worth something in the world. It's useful for something. So the next big transition in money was the move to paper money, where for the first time, and this happened here in Asia around the 11th century AD, also in China, for the first time, it's just a piece of paper. It has no intrinsic value. So that was quite an interesting milestone in the history of trust in money. All that it had was a guarantee of payment from somebody who had issued this paper and put their name on it. Now, some problems developed with paper money. Actually, some problems developed with coins, too, in at least some parts of the world where they weren't trusted. And in particular, for the paper money, there was an example in 17th and 18th century Japan where different regions were issuing the paper. And as a result, there were different values attached to the paper money. And none of it could really be evaluated next to each other. There was widespread inflation, and trust was basically lost. The same thing happened, by the way, in the United States, where financial institutions actually issued the banknotes, and again, widely varying values and a loss of trust. This was solved. It was eventually solved, as you all know, because central banks took it over, and the paper did have a value because it was guaranteed. Because it was guaranteed by an entity that everybody trusted. So the same thing applies in the case of a payments network. And in this case, it's trust, again, secured by a promise. And what is that promise? The promise of the Visa brand holding it all together. Now, when you fast forward another century, this is a quote from our founder, D. Hock. About 60 years ago, so in the 1950s, he had a vision. And his vision was that money could become fully electronic. It would become nothing but electrons and photons that move around this world at the speed of light, that any individual could use at any time, wherever they happen to be, 7 days a week. It's quite amazing that he had this vision in the middle of the last century, a vision of what we now call anytime, anywhere commerce, right? Before the internet, before mobile phones, before any of that, he dreamed of this kind of vision. But he also understood that it could only happen based on the history of everything that had happened before. It could only be realized, especially when you think of invisible money now, right? Electrons moving around the world. It could only happen with a promise that gave people reason to trust. And it's a good question. Why should that merchant that I mentioned, that small micro merchant that I might tender my plastic card to, why should that merchant trust that that is actually a representation and a guarantee of payment from me to him or her? And of course, the reason is what I mentioned. The reason is the Visa name. The reason is the trust that all of us working together have built over time. Now, it wasn't always, it wasn't easy to get there. So you might not know that originally, the predecessor of Visa Bank AmeriCard, it was a cardboard card. Cardboard, a piece of cardboard, like an identity card. And in order to prevent fraud, the company issued books, paper manuals that listed all the cards that had been reported lost or stolen. And when you were a merchant or you were presenting your card, they would look through this book to see if the card was compromised. So this was A, not efficient, and B, it created quite a problem of fraudsters being able to take advantage of the system. So the next thing that happened was in 1973, again, the founders of the company, including Mr. Hawk, decided to use technology, global telecommunications technology combined with emerging data processing systems to create the world's first electronic payments network so that identities could be verified in real time and begin to combat fraud. And again, fast forward now 40 years, and we're looking at the result of that. Electronic authorization succeeded in reducing the fraud rate, combined with a lot of other advancements, let's face it, reducing the fraud rate by more than by more than 1/3 in the last 25 years. So that's the chart you see on the left. Bringing our fraud rates down to the current incredibly low rates of less than 10 basis points, for every, which means less than 10 cents for every $100 transacted. Of course, it wasn't just electronic authorizations. It was a lot of other things that we all participated in, the movement from magnetic stripe to chip, the introduction of scoring models to identify suspicious transactions, even moving from that into the world of artificial intelligence to detect fraud, and on it goes. But the amazing thing is, even as in the last 15 years, we've seen the amount of personal data being stolen from industries throughout the world increase dramatically, to the point that in 2017, that high bar on the right, more than 2.3 billion records were exposed in the world across all industries. And all that data is being used to create false identities and seek to commit fraud. Nevertheless, because of the vigilance and everything we've built so far, we have been able to maintain that low fraud rate of less than 10 basis points across the entire world. So if we're doing so well, why am I so fixated on trust today? Why did I want to talk about trust today and make this big point about how we all need to work together to maintain it? Why? Because of what Chris was talking about, because we're at a true inflection point in the history of digital payments. And it has to do with the number of devices, the incredible increase in connectivity that we're seeing and that Chris referred to. We started here back in the 1990s, the birth of electronic payments on basically desktop computers. And we're moving along this graph through mobile phones to a world of the Internet of Things, to a world where we anticipate, according to recent research, that 70% of the world, more than 5 billion people, will be connected via mobile devices by 2020, just 2 years from now. And there will be more than 21 billion of those connected devices. And as Chris mentioned, we at Visa believe that from a payments perspective, our current 3 billion cards will be transformed into 30 billion ways to pay through all those devices, and that our 46 million merchant locations will become 400 million ways to accept payments, all because of this explosion in connectivity and people being much more connected than they ever were before. Now, what does that mean? From a security perspective, we all know connectivity means if we're connected with each other, some of us, maybe not in this room, but some of us are going to use that connectivity to take advantage of the others and steal things and commit fraud. So connectivity is a challenge. The second thing that's happening, and Chris alluded to this a little bit, is we're getting into a world not only of hyper-connectivity, but what I might call hyper-convenience. to the point where the payment is so tightly integrated into the payment, into the commercial experience, into the transaction, that you don't even realize or you don't pay attention to the fact that it's happening. That's kind of the ultimate in taking security for granted or payments for granted. So think about things that we probably all do every day or at least every week. Things like using a rideshare service. In the US, we use Uber and Lyft. Here you might use Grab or Didi in Asia. The payment takes place behind the scenes. We're increasingly seeing where you can order in an app at a restaurant or at a grocery store, and the payment again takes place without your ever having to do anything in the store. In fact, some of those big techs, Amazon in particular, and Alibaba, that many of you I'm sure have seen this in China, are using stores where you can just walk in, use the app, take the goods, and walk out without ever standing in line, without ever making a payment to a clerk at a checkout. We call these ambient payments. I might call them hyper-convenience. And they're changing the way we pay. Other examples, not quite so invisible, at the Pyeongchang Olympics, customers were able to pay with gloves and stickers and pins, right? You didn't have to have a card. There was still a terminal, but you could pay with all these new devices. Same thing in the Rio Olympics in the summer. People paid with rings. People are increasingly paying with QR codes. Different forms of payment that are so much faster and more convenient that they practically disappear. Now, with this increasing hyper connectivity and hyper convenience, there's another thing going on, what I might call hyper-criminality. There's a direct connection between the complexity and the connectivity and the convenience that we're seeing and the ability of criminals to exploit it. In fact, the criminal networks that are exploiting the payment system today are now organized economic enterprises. They're not some guy or gal in a hoodie in a garage somewhere. They are organized businesses. In fact, as much as a $600 billion illegal industry has been built on defrauding the payments industry. So the complexity and the demand for convenience is actually accelerating the problem that we've seen before that we call asymmetric threats. What do we mean by asymmetric? Most of you, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about. That's where we have to protect everything. We have to be right 100% of the time in protecting data, in detecting fraud, but they only have to be right once. So although we have scale, they also have scale, and the risk from asymmetric threats is on the increase. As I mentioned, these groups are very well organized, they're very well funded, and they're actually turning this into what you might call identity theft as a service. So you can purchase online, if you like. I don't recommend it. A subscription-based identity theft service where you can pay $1,000 maybe for 30 days access to a compromised computer. You don't have to do it yourself. You can also buy hacking kits with all the latest malware. Again, online, freely available. And we have made progress by moving from magnetic stripe to chip, right, throughout the world. In so doing, we have changed the opportunity for this very well-organized criminal enterprise. The opportunity, the biggest opportunity used to be, okay, steal data en masse from a merchant environment because merchants have vulnerable data in their possession. Use it to create counterfeit cards and then commit fraud. As we move to chip, the threat is evolving. That has no longer become the greatest opportunity. And instead, we're seeing more innovation. We're seeing actually the criminals move upstream from the merchant environment, the brick and mortar merchant environment where they can get the data for counterfeit fraud. They're moving upstream to financial institutions, and they are experimenting with attacks more against banks. In addition, of course, brick and mortar no longer being the biggest opportunity, they're moving to attack e-commerce merchants and commit e-commerce fraud. Now, in the financial institution realm, I'm sure you're all familiar with the ATM Cashout Attack, a few cards being used to monetize, stolen data being used to create counterfeit cards, which are then used to go to the ATM. By the way, by cash-out gangs, not by the actual criminal masterminds. So these cash-out gangs are taking the risk. And typically, these attacks take place when the controls inside the bank have been turned off by the criminals, and the attack can take place unrestricted because any limits on withdrawals have been removed, and always during off hours. So they're coming after you with ATM cash-out attacks. They're coming after issuers with brute force attacks, which I'll talk about a little later, to enumerate card numbers, CVV2s, and expiration dates. And they are also exploiting business processes. They'll actually research specific vulnerabilities that issuers have in their fraud detection and fraud management capabilities, and they'll identify specific issuers that they can exploit because of gaps in business logic. And just for a real example, we know of an issuer somewhere in the world who didn't have a rule established for how many times a wrong CVV2 could be entered before raising a flag in the fraud detection rules. So what the criminals have learned to do, instead of trying to use one or two merchants to brute force at CVV2, they'll do it across multiple, hundreds of merchants, so it's difficult for the acquirer to see. And when the issuer doesn't have a rule, and they know that, they know exactly which issuer to target. And in this case, although it was only a 1 in 1,000 chance of guessing the CVV2, they were able to do it in seconds. And of course, as we move into the chip world, card not present is increasingly attacked. Although card not present sales account for only 47% of global total sales in the Visa system, only a 2% year-on-year increase, fraud in the CRP environment now accounts for 65% of total fraud. So huge issue and priority for all of us to secure that card not present environment. Now, the good news is, one thing, all these things are changing. We have hyperconnectivity, we have hyperconvenience, we have hypercriminality. But one thing I don't think we do need to change, we do know the fundamentals of what we need to do to protect ourselves, which is why, as I showed you before, that fraud rate really hasn't gone up in spite of all this. So our challenge is to continue to execute on these 4 pillars, which I've shown you before, and which Visa has shown all of you, I'm sure, before in many settings, of protecting data, devaluing data, harnessing data, and empowering consumers. Protecting data, not going to dwell on it, but it is foundational. We've moved as an industry from the issue being defense, right? Firewalls, keep them out, to resilience, which is assume you could be breached but be able to detect it immediately and shut it down, to needing to devalue the data in our own internal environments via things like encryption, so that even if they do get in, and even if you don't immediately detect them, there's nothing of value for them to steal. And finally, we need to worry, even if we have all that in place, that our own internal staff might betray us, and we need to be using detection systems to watch for unexpected and suspicious activity within our own 4 walls by our own insiders. So all those things is the evolution of security. We have to keep our focus, particularly in the financial institutions, which are increasingly under attack, have to keep our focus on security. But the other thing we know, if we're going to have 30 billion ways to pay and 400 million ways to be paid, we can't have vulnerable data in all those places. So devaluing the data so that if it's stolen, it can't be used to commit fraud is critical. And CHIP does that, of course, with a one-time message, the cryptogram. Tokenization does the same, again, using domain-restricted tokens with cryptograms to devalue the data. Very important. And of course, harnessing data, so many things happening in this space, all starting with the fraud detection algorithms that we all use, and Visa Advanced Authorization, we're very proud of, currently has moved from a model-based to a machine learning, and many years ago moved to a machine learning context where over 500 data elements are analyzed in a millisecond as the transaction travels between the merchant, between the Visa data centers to the issuer, back to the merchant. Within that split second, those 500 data points are used to assess the likelihood of fraud. And in fact, in North America, one of our clients in a financial institution was able to reduce its card not present fraud rate from 43 basis points all the way down to 8 basis points just by tuning the rules in this Visa Advanced Authorization service. Now, we've also extended that service to merchants. So we've always had, for quite a while, CyberSource Decision Manager. We also have a new product called Visa Transaction Advisor, originally used for automated fuel dispensers in the United States, commonly used by fraudsters to test accounts. Again, a similar model using machine learning to detect suspicious behavior, very effective in reducing counterfeit fraud by as much as 50% at participating stations. And we're now extending that product, the Visa Transaction Advisor product, beyond that context, beyond fuel stations in China, where nearly 800,000 merchants are using it to detect suspicious transactions, and resulting in an 80% reduction in counterfeit fraud rates reported by issuers. So there's other things happening in this space that I'll talk about in a second, things like 3D Secure 2.0 that I think you're probably mostly familiar with, and the advent of biometrics as an increasingly important and popular tool among consumers to replace static data like passwords and PINs. Empowering consumers. We believe that the consumer is a very effective and highly underutilized resource in the fight against fraud. One of the most powerful tools, which is widely deployed, I believe, in this region, if you're not using it, we highly recommend that you do, is transaction alerts, real-time alerts, so that the consumer sees in real time through a text message or email or other types of alerts, mobile banking apps, that their card has been used. And if it's not them, they can immediately report that incident to the issuer and shut down any fraud that might be happening instantly, again, reducing the impact of fraud. And increasingly, consumers are finding transaction controls, another very important and interesting development that's enabled by mobile banking apps and other similar types of apps that Visa also offers, called Visa Transaction Controls, so that you can control, as a consumer, where your card is used. You can say, I don't want my card used online until I turn it on. I don't want my card used outside of Singapore unless I have turned it on. And what has enabled this to be useful is the fact that you can do it electronically. In the old days, if you had to call the call center, people would forget, and then their card would be declined, and then they wouldn't have access, and it would take them 10 minutes to call, and all that sort of thing. It was a big problem. Nowadays, if they forget, so easy to turn it back on if it's really them that's trying to do a transaction. So highly encourage the use of these current technologies to empower consumers and reduce fraud. In fact, we had an issuer in the US when they turned on alerts, real-time alerts, they were able to reduce the fraud on that portfolio where consumers just had access to alerts by 40%. So that's what's existing today. That's our 4 pillars. You've heard about them before. There's developments in all 4, but what's really exciting are some of the things that we're doing for the future, new things. And in particular, you'll hear more about this from Penny Lane, who is about to speak after the break. And I'm incredibly excited and impressed by the work that this team has done. It's really quite revolutionary in the industry to actually disrupt the disruptors, to start fighting back against those criminals who have such an organized way of attacking us. So some of the things that we're doing in this space, we have something called the Card Attack tool. It's using artificial intelligence, and we just deployed it in March, but it's already showing promising results to stop those brute force payment account enumeration attacks. By applying deep learning to the number of transactions that are processed through Visa, and as you can imagine, hundreds of billions of transactions per year, we can identify the bins and merchants that are being used by hackers and trying to guess through automated testing. And when we see those patterns, of course, we're not seeing them. The machine is seeing them. The artificial intelligence is seeing them. We also can eliminate or vastly reduce false positives and identify those attacks, notify the institution that's being tested, and shut it down. On the ATM Cashout side, we have the Visa Vital Signs tool. We've had it for quite a while. It's able to identify those odd transactions that the issuer can't see because inside the bank, the controls have been turned off, or perhaps in some institutions, smaller ones, they don't have humans watching during these off hours when the attacks occur. So we understand that these reports are, these attacks continue to happen in very large numbers. In fact, the media reported a $19 million ATM loss for an African bank. They happen so quickly that the banks aren't able to respond, but VisaNet can see it, and we can notify you or even shut down the affected account, the affected bin if it's bad enough, or the affected terminals that are ATM machines that are causing it. We use that tool to identify literally dozens of cash outs in 2017. Another thing we're doing, and Penny's going to talk about this in depth, I believe, so I won't go into it in great length, but we've just recently developed an e-commerce threat disruption tool. It is detection, but it's also disruption, and very importantly, disruption. And historically, we've been looking for breaches by looking where the fraud occurs. We see the common point of purchase where cards used in the fraud were used before the fraud, and we say, oh, that's where the data was stolen. We call that common point of purchase. Today, we have the capability to look further upstream before any fraud has occurred by identifying the malicious servers that sent the malware to a known breach, and then watch where those servers are also communicating within the environment. So if the servers were known to be communicating with a given merchant that we know was breached because they detected it and found it, we can then find hundreds, maybe even thousands of other merchants that have been affected by that same malware injected by that same command and control server. So we're able to detect the possibility of a breach before any data may have even leaked out, and certainly before fraud occurs. Very new but potentially revolutionary technology using a combination of our fraud capabilities and our cybersecurity teams in intelligence. And we can also, of course, once we know the infected merchant has this malware, we can notify all of you what those malware signatures are, what those indicators of compromise are to protect yourselves, even if we don't see you infected yet. And finally, again, very new, something called payment attack scenario simulation. It's like a red team. So you're probably all familiar that most institutions, many institutions, are using red teams to try to hack into their own defenses and so that you can identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities and fix them before an actual criminal hacks in. What we're doing is creating a tool that will enable you to determine if you have any of these vulnerabilities, these process vulnerabilities that I was talking about, like the bank that didn't have a rule to shut down multiple CVV2 attempts. So we can create a tool so that you can test yourselves against known vulnerabilities that have been detected at other issuers. If the fraudsters are probing you to see if you have those vulnerabilities, it could be very valuable for you in partnership with us to probe yourselves and identify them before a real fraudster finds them. So that is the payment attack scenario simulation tool, similar to the red team, to get ahead of these types of attacks. Now, finally, I talked about devaluing data. Tokenization has to be the solution, and we believe EMV, network tokenization, to be the solution for digital commerce. Without tokenization, we are going to be highly exposed with such a vast attack surface of billions of devices out there. They cannot contain vulnerable data. I can't say that often enough. So tokenization today is used, EMV tokenization is largely used in the mobile payment space. The Android Pays, Samsung Pays, and Google Pay, and Apple Pays of the world. As you know, it replaces the sensitive data with a unique identifier. Very easy to manage the replacement of that identifier without having to replace the card and so forth and so on. In the future, it's going to be critical to move it beyond the plastic card into the wearables and really shut down those data compromises happening in the merchant environment. I truly believe that merchants need to be taken out of the business of protecting vulnerable data from these very highly organized fraudsters. Identity. Some call it the next frontier in security, not just in payments, but certainly in payments, it's incredibly important to the future of risk management. I talked about having the ability to trust someone that you absolutely don't know, basically creating a virtual handshake through the miracle of electronic networks that validate each side of the transaction is real. The trouble is that the techniques we've been using historically, which is something that you have, used to be a piece of cardboard, now it could be a plastic card, something that you have and something that you know, a PIN, a password. Those things have been heavily, heavily exploited by the fraudsters. We have to move beyond those things because they're so easily stolen and static. And not only that, once we tell people, you have to keep changing your password because they might be stolen. Oh yes, change your password every 30 days, and change your password every 30 days on 30 websites. And they should all be different, and they should all be complex. And none of them should have any relationship to anyone or anything you know or anything that you've ever done. This is ridiculous, right? People can't do this, and they're thoroughly sick and tired of it. So we believe that we are going to move beyond something that you have and something that you know in the traditional sense. And what are we going to move to? We believe we have to move to more unique, dynamic, and contextual elements. Fundamentally today, biometrics plus behavioral and contextual data used by artificial intelligence-based models to detect whether that transaction and that person conducting the transaction is really you. Those two things are the key to identity in the future of payments, in our opinion. And they will make it not only easier and faster, but also much more secure than we are today. So a lot of this is going on today already. So you may have seen, some of you might have an iPhone 10, facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, widely used on mobile phones and readily accepted by consumers. Biometric cards, we are actually experimenting with an issuer in the US and another one in Europe, the actual biometric reader on a plastic card. Great for those environments like North America, like Europe, where people are kind of in love with their plastic cards and not that interested in moving to rings and phones and gloves and all that kind of thing. Possible solution. And in addition, as Chris said, we don't think we know all the answers. We think the answers will come from within the industry as to what will be accepted and used and effective in a particular country or payments environment. So we're trying to facilitate that with two things. The first is Visa ID Intelligence, which offers a curated selection, meaning we curate it. We look at it and decide whether it's worth offering to you. A selection of advanced authentication technologies, which would include biometrics, and you can access it through the Visa Developer Platform that Chris also mentioned. And then we have Visa Ready for Biometrics, which enables third-party solutions to reach scale by meeting standards that Visa puts out into the environment, and we can certify or labs that we license can certify that those solutions are actually valuable and worthwhile for you to deploy. So again, not trying to pick the winners and losers, a lot happening in this space and things that you can rely on in the future. "3D Secure 2.0, I know that's a big topic here in Asia Pacific. Big element in our view to facilitate that exchange of information that will enable contextual, behavioral, data-based authentication. I've been hearing from both sides of the community, merchant and issuer, for many years, if only we had more information, we could do so much better in identifying consumers, increasing authorization rates, reducing conversion rates, and growing commerce. Why? Because with more information exchanged through this pipeline, you would be able to identify the consumer just based on the data. The issuer would not have to step up and ask for a separate password, static or one time, that interferes with the transaction, introduces friction, and results in abandonment. Now, 3D Secure was once just a channel, really, for communication between the merchant and the issuer, where the issuer asked for a password, originally a static password, then a one-time password, but now we have enhanced it, a standard for the whole industry to adopt, the 2.0 standard, so that it becomes a channel for information exchange that will have all those benefits that I just described. And we feel so strongly about the value of this tool that we actually acquired a company, Cardinal Commerce, to help us deploy it throughout the world and help you, obviously, deploy it throughout the world. Finally, secure remote commerce is a standard that was put out some months ago by EMVCo. Chris talked about the value of standards in an open ecosystem. It enables the combination of all those elements that I just described for the future of securing digital commerce. Tokenization, 3D Secure 2.0 for the information exchange, and better authentication through multiple channels like, but not limited to, biometrics. So a flexible solution for payment security that combines all of those elements and in addition actually simplifies the checkout experience. If we can all work together to adopt this solution, the consumer will no longer and the merchant will no longer be confronted with so many different options for payment. It will become more like the physical environment where a single terminal can facilitate payments across multiple brands. The program that Visa is launching, and we just announced it last month, we're calling Visa Digital Commerce Program, to try to drive adoption of the secure remote commerce standard across the industry. All very new, So we're talking about the future here, but the elements for the future really are here today, and they will not only increase security and drive trust, but also enable growth by taking friction out of the system and simplifying the experience for consumers and for merchants. In summary, I hope I've convinced you that none of these great things that Chris talked about and I've talked about, the use of the digital environment to facilitate payments and make life better through the miracle of digital payments for people all over the world, can't happen without trust. Trust is the foundation. Trust has always been driven by security, not only in digital payments, but in the history of money. In the digital world, we as security professionals, everybody here in this room, has to be thinking about innovating security because the criminals are innovating on the other side. We have to be adopting the technologies of the future, not those of the past. But the good news is many of those tools, those future tools, are already here today, and they will enable us to move from protecting ourselves, from constantly being on defense, to moving into the offensive mode, meaning going on offense, meaning taking the fight to the criminals through those tools that I talked about, where we can identify their attacks early and even work with law enforcement to shut them down before they cause fraud, disrupting the disruptors, proactively identifying, detecting those threats and mitigating them before they can cause harm, and finally, adopting the technologies of the future to secure the card-not-present e-commerce environment through things enabled by that secure remote commerce standard. And if we all work together, because as Chris said so accurately, nobody can do this alone, not any of you and not us, even an issuer or a merchant can't fully protect themselves when they're connected to a system like this. If we all work together, I'm very, very confident that we will deliver against the promise to maintain trust in digital payments as it grows to 3 billion ways to pay and 400 million ways to be paid, which will, for sure, enable individuals, businesses, and communities to thrive. Thank you.